Okay, welcome to the session on feminism. We are still within the theory section of the course, and this is assessed on paper 1 and paper 3, with a 10 on paper 1 and a 10 and a 20 on paper 3, although obviously feminism is a theoretical perspective that you are going to use in pretty much every single part of the course. Okay, the first thing to talk about is the definition of feminism, so I'll let you read it first. So if society benefits men, that is going to happen in a load of different ways. It's going to happen in terms of the ideas that we transmit to people in society, and it's going to happen in terms of the material factors that Marxists talk about, so about who has money, who owns businesses, etc. The first thing to say is you've probably come across feminism quite a lot in popular culture, and that you would know it as a political movement. It would be MPs, it would be activists, it might be charities arguing for a feminist perspective. That is, that they want women to be equal to men and that they believe that men have more power than women currently. The Everyday Sexism Project is a good example of this, where women go up and they write down their experiences of sexism, and it is then published for everybody else to read, and there's that kind of solidarity. We're actually not going down that track because we are not doing politics, we're doing sociology. What we're going to look at is the theoretical perspective of feminism. So what the difference is politics is about making change in the real world now. What laws can be passed? What can we do? How do we change things? Which MPs do we speak to? What beliefs do they have? Theoretical is when you're trying to understand society. So a feminist theory is an attempt to explain the way that society works and what are the different factors that lead to that. That's what we're looking at, the theory of feminism. Now, the theory of feminism comes in 4 different forms in sociology. Liberal feminism, which focuses on culture and the law. Radical feminism, which argues the personal experiences are actually your political experiences. Marxist feminism, which suggests that in fact capitalism is the source of sexism and patriarchy. And finally, difference feminism, which argues that there isn't really such a thing as one type of feminism. Okay, and we're going to track our way through each of these 4 theories, ending with an evaluation. Liberal feminism, number 1. Liberal feminism starts with the premise that we need to focus on the law and culture of our society. Things can be better. There is a slow march of progress throughout the history of society, and we are getting towards a better life for women. Liberal feminists are optimists. They believe that we can change the law and we can change culture to try and make a better world for women. They focus on this idea of gender roles. All of us have a role in society. Our role might be the job we play, our role in the household, as you've looked at in families, might be as the breadwinner or as the homemaker. We all have these roles. Now, our gender roles are the actions that we are expected to play, that we are expected to do because of the gender that we are. So if you are a woman in this society, you are expected to behave in a certain way, and that's because of your socialization. If you doubt this, then think about being a woman in Saudi Arabia. Would you argue for a second that being a woman in Saudi Arabia and being a woman in the UK are the same thing? Now, as we're going to look at in a second, clearly there are biological, not just similarities, women are identical in Saudi Arabia and the UK biologically in terms of their sexual organs, in terms of their bodies. But in terms of their socialization, they are incredibly different. So the gender role that we play is something that can be shifted and can be changed, and for the liberal feminist can be improved. And finally, the final step for a liberal feminist is that we defeat patriarchy. We defeat this ideology that men are better than women. That's what patriarchy is, the ideology that states that men are better than women, through changing norms and values step by step. If you want to think about who might count as liberal feminists, then think of the suffragettes. They focused on changing the law, primarily the law to allow women to vote. And so they focused on this step-by-step change. They didn't say men are the enemy. They didn't try and attack capitalism. What they wanted was the law to change, and in the end, to make a better world for women. So, laws and policies. Well, pressuring the government to pass laws to emancipate women is the key task of the liberal feminist. So let's have a look at our example here. There are laws against gender discrimination at work. Why? Why are there laws against being sexist at work? Well, it's because liberal feminists argued that that is what should happen. They argued that the best way to defeat patriarchy is to get rid of gender discrimination at work, plus lots of other different laws. Cultural change. So alongside changing the laws and policies of a country, you've also got to try and change the way people are socialised. You have to challenge ideas of natural abilities of men and women based on biology. Men are stronger than women. Women are more emotional than men. Men are more rational than women. These kinds of stereotypes need to be challenged because they are simply a cultural creation. These stereotypes that women are too emotional were once used as a reason that we could never have a female prime minister. It was said before Margaret Thatcher was going to be prime minister that she wouldn't be able to do it because she would have a period once a month. That was actually an argument put forward by serious political figures. And so those stereotypes are cultural. They are created by culture. And so for the liberal feminist, we have to change those cultural stereotypes. Sex and gender. Okay. Sex is your biological body, according to the liberal feminist. And males and females are different. Gender is socially constructed. Just have a look at those words. Socially constructed. Socially meaning society. Constructed meaning built. So if something is socially constructed, it is built by society. We've come up with it. We've created it. So your gender role, what is expected of women, childcare for example, is just an invention by this culture. There could be another culture where men look after the women. And that's what we're seeing increasingly now in our society. Those gender roles are shifting and changing. So a biological difference would be your sex, whether you have a penis or a vagina. Whether your body is flooded with testosterone or estrogen, primarily. Whether you have muscular strength or whether you have less muscular strength. These are all to do with sex. We cannot change those, argue the liberal feminists. But we can change gender. We can change our sexual preferences. Some women fancy women, some men fancy men. And so those sexual preferences can shift and change. Aggression and caring. Are these really male characteristics or female characteristics? Or can they shift and can they change? Are they really only associated to one gender? The liberal feminists would say no. Public and private sphere. So think about this functionalist idea that men have to go out into the public sphere whilst women remain in the private sphere. That is a gender role that they have assigned to women. It is not based on your sex. It is actually based on your gender. And remember, gender can change because we built it in the first place. So how do gender roles actually favour men, according to the liberal feminist? Well, this is a good way of expressing it, I hope. Think about this idea of the man being the breadwinner. He goes out and does the job. He gets the money, he comes home, the woman is at home caring for the kids. Because he's the breadwinner, he gets the money. Money's paid into his account. He has control of that. Because he's got the money, he makes the decisions. Well, I think we should move house. I should go and get this other job. I think we should buy this. I think we should buy that. Because he makes the decisions, he's dominant. He has control. He's the one who is deciding. And so the relationship between the man and the woman suddenly becomes one of dominance and control. Because he's dominant and in control, he thinks he deserves to be dominant and in control. And so he goes through a process of self-justification. The man says, well, you know what? I deserve to be in control because I'm the breadwinner. And I'm the breadwinner, which means I get the money, which means I make the decisions, which means I'm dominant, which means I deserve to make the decisions because I'm the breadwinner. And so gender roles end up creating this vicious cycle where men believe that they should be in control. Gender roles like breadwinner and homemaker end up favouring men, giving men power and control over women. So a summary. They focus on human and civil liberties, so laws and policies. They argue for changes to law and culture. Gender roles that we have are socially constructed to favour men. And they are directly challenging Parsons here, who claims men and women play these different roles, instrumental and expressive. They are attacking that very idea. Liberal feminists are also really positive. So their challenging of patriarchy is a win-win. Men get to express their feminine side as well. Men get to look after their children and go part-time. Women get to go out to work and to gain power and to gain this kind of self-actualization. So by defeating patriarchy, women win and men win. Okay. So let's track now to our second theory that we need to look at. We're going to look now at radical feminism, the second in our line. Radical means change. It means quite extreme change in society. And radical feminists, they want a big change to society. They're not happy with the slow, step-by-step, legalistic change of the liberal feminists. They are far more aggressive with this, and they believe that the problem needs to be dealt with directly. Let's track this through. Radical feminists, patriarchy is universal and fundamental. Patriarchy is everywhere. All men oppress all women, and it is a fundamental fact, so it has to happen in all societies. Oppression is personal. When men are sexist towards women, it shouldn't be dealt with in terms of the law. It should be dealt with in terms of its effect on women directly, their experiences and their feelings. How do we defeat it? Well, radical feminists say we defeat it through separatism, consciousness raising, and lesbianism, and we'll come to those three as we move through. It's worth pointing out here that we've flashed up an image of a women's refuge, and that's something that is really helpful to think about as we move through here. When women suffer domestic violence, they have an option to go to what's called a women's refuge. These are women's only spaces where women can meet, can discuss their experiences away from men. That's a radical feminist solution, to separate off from men because men are the problem. Let's examine this first point. Patriarchy is universal. Universal means everywhere. It exists in all societies. Because some radical feminists have theorised that this is probably to do with childbearing. Because women have to get pregnant and have children, they are dependent on men for a certain period. And what men do is they take advantage of that and end up dominating the society that they're in. Radical feminists suggest that patriarchy is the most important form of inequality. Men are women's main enemy. So forget class, forget the Marxists, forget the law, forget any other problem in society. For radical feminists, the main focus must be patriarchy. That is the key form of inequality. Even racism is less important than patriarchy. Men are women's main enemy. All men oppress all women, and especially through sex, and we'll come to that in a moment. And so this very radical statement, this extreme statement, is that all men are actually guilty of this oppression. Let's track this through now. The personal is political. For radical feminists, you cannot simply change a law to improve the situation, because this sexism, this patriarchy, is happening personally to individuals. And so to understand patriarchy, you have to understand the experiences of women. Patriarchy is not a cold, legalistic form of discrimination. So that's challenging the liberal feminist there. It is not some distant form of discrimination at work, for example. Discrimination happens in the private sphere. It happens at home. It happens in those interactions between husband and wife, father and child, father and daughter. Because all relationships involve power, men use this power to dominate women on a one-to-one basis, on a one-to-one basis. And through controlling women's bodies, men control them politically in wider society. This is called sexual politics. So because men have this dominance over women at home, because they use their physical size and they use their sexual dominance, they control women outside the home. So you can see here the liberal feminists have focused on the public sphere, on politics, to try and change the laws. But radical feminists say, no, you've got to go to the home. You've got to go to where women are having interactions with men and men are controlling them sexually. And this can be seen through domestic violence, rape, sexual harassment. For a radical feminist, this is the true source of discrimination. This is the true source of sexism. It's the fact that men will use their sexual dominance to control women, and that's the thing that you need to change. So how do you challenge it? Well, number one, separatism. Living apart from men it means that you're free from this sexual politics. Separatism just means to live apart, to be separate. So if you don't live with men, then you don't have that sexual politics to worry about. You don't have to worry about rape and domestic violence. Germaine Greer, who's a very famous radical feminist, argues for matrilocal households instead of the nuclear family. So this is a household made up of women, where women are in control. And so you can move away from that sexual politics that ends up dominating women outside the home as well as inside the home. Women's refuges are a really good example of separatism. How do you solve a problem like domestic violence? Well, don't live with men. That's the radical feminist solution. Consciousness raising. So this is where women share experiences in women-only groups. It can often lead to collective action, like the Women's March. So you may be familiar with the really, really large Women's March across the world where women wore pink and marched partially to counteract what they saw as a sexist president being elected in America, and also to protest things like domestic violence. And so, again, this consciousness raising, this raising of ideas is really, really, really important. And finally, political lesbianism, and this might be one of the stranger ones to hear about, but it was very popular in the 60s and 70s. It was this idea that heterosexual relationships, so relationships with men, was actually to sleep with the enemy. And that's an old idea that you don't have sex with your enemy during war. You don't associate with your enemy during war, so why should you now? And so the only answer then is political lesbianism, for women to actually love and to marry and to have relationships with other women. And so this was linked very closely with the gay rights movement in the 1980s. And it became a solution for many women that actually to get away from patriarchy and the sexual politics in the private sphere, you actually simply become a lesbian. So, to track it through one more time. Radical feminist patriarchy is universal and fundamental. That oppression is personal, it happens in the home. And you defeat this by not living with men, by speaking together as women, and by loving women. Third theory, Marxist feminism. Okay, this is quite different. Liberal feminists say that men dominate through culture and laws, and they dominate women. They pass laws, they socialise children to ensure that women remain under the thumb of men, and that leads to the domination of men, patriarchy. Radical feminists argue that men dominate women through personal relationships, through their one-to-one interactions. And this leads to patriarchy. Marxist feminists argue something completely different. They argue that you have to start with capitalism, that economic system that we discussed before. That economic system, through its oppression, dominates men and women. So by forcing men and women into work, and by paying them very, very little, and by creating that economic inequality, you then set up a system that benefits the capitalist over the working class. Now, this creates loads of different types of inequality. For the Marxist, it creates racism. It obviously creates the class system, but it also creates sexism as well. So for the Marxist feminist, the origin of the problem is not men and their laws and their personal relationships. It's actually the capitalist system itself. Let's have a look at this then. So patriarchy is rooted in capitalism. You don't have patriarchy if you don't have capitalism. Women serve a vital function in maintaining the capitalist system. We'll see how that works in a second. And how do we defeat patriarchy? Well, we need a revolution. We need to get rid of capitalism. The solution for Marxists, as you've seen, is always going to be to get rid of capitalism. So how is patriarchy caused by capitalism? Well, women are cheap, exploitable labour. You can pay them less, and they are paid less, as we know in our economy now. They are a reserve army of labour. So because their primary role is assumed to be in the home, they are available when you need them to go out to work. Now, my granny is a really good example of this. She was 18 when the war kicked off. She was a servant, actually, in a lord's house. And when the war kicked off, she was conscripted in to work on building parts for tanks in a factory. So she was a part of the reserve army of labour. Go and work at home, go and look after the children. When capitalism needs you, we'll send you off to work. And when capitalism stops needing you, we'll send you back into the home. Women reproduce the labour force. So because women care for children and they care for the household, they support their husbands and they support the children for free. So what a wonderful deal for capitalism. You've got these people that are going to make the system keep on running by looking after the men who are going to the factories and looking after the children and socialising them, and probably socialising them to accept capitalism. Women also absorb anger. They are takers of shit. And what we mean here is that they accept the domestic violence. They accept the children complaining at home. They take all of that anger that men feel from being dominated by the capitalist, and they absorb it. And so what this means is that when the man is then going back to work on a Monday, having got drunk on Friday night, not done much domestic labour on Saturday and Sunday, he is then ready to go back and work hard. So the women have absorbed that anger for capitalism. They're working for capitalism. Okay, now, it's not just economics that leads to patriarchy, according to the Marxist feminist. It's also ideology. And so we are not focusing here only on the economic functions of women's suppression. What we also need to think about is women's consciousness and their motivations. So we know, according to the Marxist feminists, that they are dominated by the system to essentially keep men going and keep men working and keep the system working. But what do they believe? Well, what happens is, according to the Marxist feminists, you have the nuclear family. Now, within the nuclear family, we have the oppression that we just spoke about. This leads to, the idea that a family is a good thing is then spread. You spread it through the population. Having children is morally good. If people believe in feminism, which is the ideology that family is good, then they accept their oppression. They accept the oppression within the nuclear family. Women start to believe that what is happening at home is good and moral and normal. And so we've then just created a culture. And that culture says that nuclear family is a good thing. As we know, women experience oppression in the nuclear family. But the ideology that family is good is spread, accepted, and then it shapes the culture. And so we have this beautiful cycle where women are stuck in this terrible cycle of oppression. And the capitalists love it because that means that they are not going to revolt. Well, the Marxists would argue that they're wrong because there will be a revolution. Women and men are locked into oppression, as we just saw. Men are locked into oppression because they need work, they need money. Women are locked into oppression for that diagram I just spoke about. You need to overthrow the economic system of capitalism and the ideology of feminism. That's what the Marxist feminists would argue. And if you can do that, if you can overthrow capitalism, then and only then will you have a system which does not dominate and control women. Okay, so as we mentioned before, I just wanted to flash this up again for you. For liberal feminists, it's culture and laws that dominate women and create patriarchy. For radical feminists, it's the personal relationships that end up dominating women and creating patriarchy. But for Marxist feminists, it's capitalism itself that dominates men and women together. And that's the big difference. Okay, our final theory then, difference feminism. Now, difference feminism is really, really different. What difference feminism is going to argue is that there's no such thing as a woman. At least when we're thinking about feminism, we really shouldn't be thinking about men oppressing women, because there are lots of different types of women. Middle class women, working class women. Are we going to say that the experience of women in our society is the same if you're rich or poor? Obviously not. What about religious background? Is the experience of being a woman the same if you're from a traditional Muslim family as if you're from a traditional Sikh family, or a traditional Christian family, or from an atheist family? The religious background of women is surely relevant. What about if you're heterosexual? Is experience the same as if you're gay? What about if you're black and minority ethnic? Is feminism exactly the same for white women as it is for black women? We'll see an example of potentially why not. What about if you live in a poorer country, in a developing nation? Is your experience of being a woman the same? Difference feminism argues that you cannot declare that all women experience this, because they don't. It depends on all of these factors that we've outlined: social class, ethnicity, religious background, the culture that you're born into, your sexuality. All of these change your experience of patriarchy. Here's a good example that has been highlighted by a number of sociologists. We've got an image here of a woman experiencing sexism at work. Now, it's been often reported and written about that women in high-powered positions feel like they are not listened to. One of my friends runs a company, and when they go to meetings to advertise their services, what she finds is often the men that they're advertising to will talk to the men that she is with, because they'll assume that she's a PA or something. So these examples of sexism at work, they are very frequent and they are well documented. This may be the key type of sexism that this woman experiences. Let's imagine that she lives in the UK. And it's horrible, it's terrible, and it's not something that should be talked about lightly. But there's been a lot of research by feminists into what it means to be black in America and to be a woman. Now, would we for even a second pretend that the experiences of these two people are the same? Being a woman in the Deep South in America and being black makes your life entirely different in so many different ways. And one of the key things, actually, is that for Western feminists, for feminists in sort of white European countries predominantly, they would argue that the family is a source of oppression. Now, for a black woman living in the Deep South in America, the family is a source of comfort. So difference feminists would say, we cannot generalize between two different women like this. We must understand each different context. Women are not a homogeneous group. Homo means one or single, and genuous means type, or genus means type, so one type. Women are not a homogeneous group. They're not one single group. Feminism has claimed false universality based on middle-class white Western experiences. The simple fact is, most sociology is written by white, European, middle-class men and women, and actually mainly men. So feminism so far has been dominated by American and European women, middle-class women who haven't experienced much economic suffering at all. And so any claim that, for example, that radical feminists make, that all men dominate all women, That's false universality. That's just based on a white European experience. White feminists have underplayed the role of racial oppression in black communities. So if you think about this woman here in the bottom right, what's a bigger problem for her? Sexism or racism? Well, quite a lot of sociological research would suggest that racism would be a far more significant problem for her in her life. And so for difference feminists, they would say that racism and racial oppression have been underplayed by white feminists because white feminists don't experience racism. For black women in the USA, the family, as we mentioned before, is actually a source of resistance to racism. The mother figure is a strong, dominant, controlling figure within the black family and helps that family to bond together and to fight back against the racism that they experience. So when a black woman in America hears a white feminist from Europe saying the family is the source of your oppression, they don't understand what they're talking about because the source of their oppression is white men. Liberal, radical and Marxist feminists all suffer from essentialism. And essentialism is when you think that there is one essence, one thing that makes something up. So it's if you say classic sort of stereotypes about black people or white people or Asian people, these would be essentialism. So saying that women are like this is guilty of essentialism because you're saying that there is only one type of thing that a woman is. Okay, let's have a think about how we would evaluate each of these perspectives. Now, in many ways, I've alluded to this or spoken directly to this. Difference feminism can be used to evaluate all of the previous three because it says that they all treat women as a homogenous group. And clearly, liberal feminism is really positive, whereas radical and Marxist feminism is really negative. So we've already started to see some of the ways we can evaluate. I've put this into what is hopefully a nice, clear table for you. And as I talk, I want you to focus on the sections that I tell you to focus on. So we'll start with liberal, and I'm going to work my way across evaluation 1, 2, 3, and 4. So liberal feminism, a positive evaluation here is that we can cause changes to the law. And that undoubtedly has positive impacts for women. Abortion being legal, contraception being legal and freely available. These things help women to take control of their lives. However, as it says in evaluation 2, liberal feminists have been accused of being over-optimistic. They underplay things like domestic violence and they underplay the role of capitalism. Radical and Marxist feminists would disagree, as we've mentioned already, as would difference feminists. So let's now look at the radical feminists. Positively, they've had practical application with the creation of refuges. However, evaluation number 2, Marxist feminists would argue that class is actually more important than gender. And so there would be a good sort of tussle between the two there. Evaluation 3, so radical feminists have often been accused of being utopian. That is, that they look to some perfect world in the future and that they're not particularly realistic. Is it realistic to separate women from men? Is that something that is going to happen? Is lesbianism going to take root and women are going to take it up en masse? It doesn't feel very likely. And so radical feminism is accused of just not being a particularly realistic theory. And again, we've mentioned difference feminism would accuse radical feminism of essentialism. Marxist feminism, well, the positive is that it reveals economic oppression and it reveals that actually economics can be a part of patriarchy. But evaluation number 2, it doesn't really explain why we have patriarchy in non-capitalist societies. So China, for example, isn't a capitalist society, but still has quite extreme problems with sexual oppression. Norway is a socially democratic country. They tax rich people a hell of a lot and they spread their wealth around a lot, but we still have patriarchy in Norway. Marxist feminists would argue less patriarchy, or less sexism, but still, I think the point stands. Evaluation number 3, so Marxist feminists are sex blind. So we can ask a Marxist feminist, well, look, why are women oppressed by capitalism and men less oppressed? Marxist feminists might respond by saying they're not less oppressed, men have to go to factories, etc., etc. But they're still not quite getting to the point as to why women stay at home and are dominated and men go to factories. Surely it's because there is discrimination against women. And so to talk about only capitalism feels a little bit sex blind. It feels like you're ignoring sex at all. Again, difference feminists would disagree. And finally, difference feminism. Well, one of the biggest advantages of difference feminism is that you've accepted all of these different social groups. You've started to accept some of the complexity. But evaluation number 2, you have ignored some of the similarities between women. So if you say the experience of a black woman in deep south of America is just totally different, you've probably ignored that domestic violence is a serious problem for most women across most of the world, or at least in most societies. So you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater here and ignore some of the real similarities. Evaluation number 3 is a political point. Difference feminism divides women up into different categories. Now, radical feminists would hate that, because they would say women are one team against the men, and the best chance we have is to come together. The Women's March was women all over the world marching together and were stronger for it. Difference feminism would argue that you would need hundreds of different marches because there is no one single type of women. So politically speaking, difference feminism can be argued to reduce the chance for change. And finally, it ignores the reality of oppression of all women. So for difference feminism, we again seem to lose this sense, this important sense that actually sexism is really a serious problem across the globe for most, if not all, women. Okay, exam questions. Well, paper 1 and paper 3, as we mentioned. Paper 1 would be your 10-marker, outline and explain 2 different feminist perspectives. Simply pick 2 of the ones that we've mentioned. Paper 3, evaluate the claim that there is no one single type of feminism. So what you're being asked to do here is to evaluate difference feminism, and you would obviously want to bring in the other 3 perspectives as a way of evaluating that. So a good Peel structure here would be obviously 3 Peel paragraphs. I'd want difference, and then my other 2, I'd want 2 of the others. So I would probably go liberal and Marxist, but you could easily go include radical if you wanted. Evaluate feminist approaches to sociology. Pretty simple. What I would do for this one is I would do liberal, Marxist, and radical. And for my analysis, I would keep difference, because difference is always really useful for your analysis and evaluation. Okay, I hope that was helpful.